This is Duke University.
Okay, please take your seats. Let's get ready for the second panel. And I have the pleasure of introducing to you David Robinson, who is a professor in the finance group here at Fuqua, and is going to be the moderator for this panel.
Thanks a lot. If I could just take a moment of personal privilege, I'd just like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to moderate the panel. I look forward to learning a lot today. When I was listening to the remarks over the lunch table, it reminded me of an old joke. There's a professor and his student, and they're walking down the road and they're having a conversation about how markets work and how essentially, you know, it's really abhorrent to markets that people leave money on the table. And the student, they're walking together, and the student looks down on the ground and says, "Oh, look, there's a $20 bill on the ground. I'm going to pick it up." The professor says, "Don't bother." And the student says, why not? Why shouldn't I pick it up? He says, "It's not a $20 bill. If it were, somebody would have picked it up already." A lot of my jokes kind of meet with that same response, sort of muted laughter. One day I'll learn to stop doing this. But you know, the point of that is that you know, I think part of the reason why we have problems implementing sustainability projects is it comes down to finance and financial constraints, and that's what we want to talk about today in today's panel. So what I'd like to do is start just by introducing our panelists. I'll let them tell you more about what they do, and then I think we're just going to kind of open up the discussion.
Great. Well, good afternoon. I'm Brian Weldy, and I'm with HCA, that's Hospital Corporation of America. We own and operate hospitals in 20 states, United States, and the UK. It's about 90 million square feet, 160 plus hospitals, 115 surgery centers, and 70 imaging centers. So we're a big operation, but HCA goes usually by a community-based name of the hospitals that service that community. So I'm the Vice President, Engineering and Facility Management, and deal with the facility operations to optimize the company's performance around its assets. Glad to be here.
All right, I'm Jeremy Lemieux with Diversey. Is this too loud or not too loud? Diversey is probably a company that a lot of you aren't familiar with. You've probably heard of SC Johnson. We are of that same family of companies, but we are the B2B side of the business. I've been with the company for 7 years, and my primary responsibility is overseeing our energy investments and our carbon reduction programs, and also our partnership with the WWF Climate Savers Program. Diversey committed to this program a number of years ago. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with it, but it's a fairly rigorous program, and as a corporation, we've committed to make an absolute carbon reduction across our global portfolio of 25% below our 2003 levels by 2013. And in the process of doing that, we also have to deliver about $1, or actually $2.20 for every dollar that we spend in the process of doing that.
My name is Paul Baier with a services company called Groom. We do energy efficiency projects and consulting projects for companies, and hope to bring perspective on what we're seeing out there in a lot of companies. Dan and I talked earlier this year. We continue to see dozens of projects that are $300,000, $400,000, $800,000 projects that have less than an 18-month payback or 12-month payback that's still being implemented using existing technology and everything else. So I do believe there's at least a 20 on the floor here, and I think what you guys are doing here, look at this Rubik's Cube and understand all the impediments is really important work, because this is where the rubber hits the road here.
Thanks a lot. You know, I teach corporate finance, I teach entrepreneurial finance, and you know, when you approach financial problems from that level of abstraction, it's really simple. You just calculate the NPV of the project, and if that number is positive, well, then you put a check mark there, and if it's negative, you put an X. But the reality is a lot more complicated. In fact, I think there's a lot of horse trading that goes along inside the firm, trying to discuss what kind of projects get funded and what kind of projects don't get funded, what sort of rules of thumb that we use to evaluate projects by, what are sort of the internal dynamics that determine whether projects get launched. And so what I thought we could do is have a discussion around those very ideas. And so what I thought I would propose is, Let's start just by telling a story, an example of a project that either was successfully implemented or was not implemented, and talk about the financial constraints that had to be overcome to implement the project or ultimately prevented the project from getting off the ground. I figured if we did that, we've got enough variety and perspective that we're liable to get a lot of interesting points of view here, and then from there we can kind of break out into the tables. So, Brian, I'm picking on you because
Sure.
you're standing closest to me. But
well, let me
first
tee this up to say that I'm going to be talking today from two perspectives. One is what I see happening in HCA, but also my experience in being in facility management and energy engineer for 26 years, and to see where I think the financing piece fits into that. So first off, just kind of to set this up, is that no one can doubt that you have to have the finance to fund your ideas. I mean, it's really the spark that lights off the energy efficiency rocket, isn't it? You've got to have the money to launch your ideas. So once you realize that, you have to figure out, how do I become more effective in getting the talk out there on my financing? So really, if you think about, how many of you out there can speak 2 or more languages? Raise your hand. Okay. Well, finance is a language. And for those that were learning their second language, what are the things that you remember about that? You might have gotten Rosetta Stone and something and learned about how to learn the language, and you're really impressed by you're talking to yourself about it. But the minute you got into a conversation with someone who's very fluent in that language, you got lost, didn't you? You felt frustrated. So then you move into a point where you become more familiar with it, where you get around people to learn that language, and you become what? Conversational. So you can have some good dialogue, and then eventually you move into being fluent. So the next thing to consider is, how do I become conversational about financial matters? Not an expert, because I'm an engineer, and I tell you what, I understand engineering principles, but finance and accounting, now that's an art and science that I'm a little bit still confused about. Debt's over here, credit's over here, they're fighting each other. I'm always trying to figure out what that really means, but engineering's a little clearer to me. So the idea is understand the language. The third component, very important, is once you understand that, it's a 2-component thing of both collaboration with the right individuals, and then how you take that collaboration into solutions. So in collaboration, what do I mean by that? And I give you now I'll get to a specific example. Nick Fowler came with us with the Climate Corps to help us. We'd identified several projects in HCA. One of them was lighting, and we really needed to have some horsepower put around some detailed thought on the financing of a lighting retrofit project. So Nick went into the details. He learned about lighting. He had training on lighting already, and started running the financials. Okay, so he comes to me with this analysis, and it was great. But the next thing that we worked together on was, how do we collaborate around this solution financially? So you sit down. First of all, we sat down with an accountant. We sat down with a tax person. We sat down with a treasurer individual, and we collaboratively started the dialogue around this opportunity around lighting, and got everybody on the same page. And Nick remembers this. It was a lot of bantering, discussion, back and forth about terminology. And we had one guy, I swear he's flip-flopping back and forth. Well, yeah, you could capitalize it. No, it's an expense. No, it's expense. No, it's capital. Well, I don't know. So, you're trying to figure that out, how to coach. So the good thing is that the collaboration process, we got into consensus around how to go about that. Then you move into the sort of this solutions idea. And, how many times are there a lot of ways of doing something? There are a lot of trade-offs. Sometimes I've heard, is there really the ideal best practice? Well, I think somebody said one time that they love standards because there's so many to choose from. So it's the idea of, what's the best solution for your company? What fits your culture the best? What's the function? How does it fit with your culture? And there's that cost factor weaved in there, your efficiency alternatives, and then it all ties in and boils around sustainability. So that was a long response, but I wanted to get that off my chest. Thank you.
Well, I too am an engineer, which I think equates to this idea that I learned everything I need to know about finance from Wikipedia. So forgive me at the beginning of this. For Diversey, this process has been ongoing for some time in making these investments. And there's some very interesting lessons that we learned. And one example I come back to a lot happened several years ago. About 3 months apart, we were doing 2 different lighting retrofit projects, both at existing manufacturing facilities, both, interestingly enough, very similar latitudes. Both projects were going to have about $100,000 capital investment. One was going to be in Canada. The other one was going to be at our flagship manufacturing plant in Wisconsin. And we did both of these projects. We went through the analysis, we did all of our lighting assessments, and put together a proposal. And what was interesting is what came back from that. Because what we saw was the project that we had proposed for our flagship plant in Wisconsin, I think the return on investment on that project was something like 3.1 or 3.2 years. And the capital cost for every metric ton of carbon we were going to save was about $250 US. So it was not quite within our realm of what we'd normally want to fund and such, but it was attractive. And it was ultimately going to save about $500,000 a year in energy costs at that site. Conversely, this other project that we had in, it was actually London, Ontario. That project, almost identical in nature, 400-watt high-pressure sodium lamps to T5 or T8 fixtures, similar type of idea. That one ended up coming back with a 1.1-year simple payback, but the capital cost for every ton of carbon savings was about $800 US. Now, when you look at that, you start to think, okay, well, is it because I was a better engineer in Canada versus an engineer in the US? Was there some other factor that was there? And what we realize is there actually are factors that are well out of our control in any type of efficiency projects. And those are the cost of energy in any given market and the cleanliness of that energy. And I think there was a theme earlier on talking about the excuses that businesses or individuals or consumers give. There's one school of thought where you say, if only there were a regulatory structure in place, or if only the price of energy was the right way. And the other one saying, if only we could make investments in these areas where the energy is very dirty and such. And we can either choose to fight against that and beat our head against the wall, that sort of thing, or we can realize that's the reality and that's the market factors or the market forces, and we can use that to our advantage. And what we've learned is when we fixate on financing of projects on an individual project-by-project basis, we lose out in a massive amount of opportunity, not just in the rate of payback, but also the volume of that payback. To kind of give it an idea is, right when we started our programs, we had amassed a repository of maybe 120 potential projects globally. These were from very simple retrofit and efficiency projects to very complicated on-site power programs. And when we applied the more classical financial approach to it, we found that only maybe 30 or 35 of those projects would actually meet our 2 primary criteria. But
and your criteria were?
We had 2 criteria. One was a 3-year simple payback, and the second one was a capital investment cost of no more than $1,200 US per metric ton, both of which were required to deliver our financial contribution and our carbon reduction commitment. So we realized, though, that if we use these traditional tools that are fixated on a very local basis and try to apply those to a global challenge and a global problem, we're using completely the wrong tool to get the benefit. But instead, when we went back and said, let's set our objectives globally. We're a global company. We make global carbon commitments. We have global expectations for our shareholders. So let's start creating global financial tools to better manage that and leverage these price and cleanliness disparities to our advantage. And the result of that is that list of 120 projects, 30, 35 of which were initially beneficial, actually increased to almost 90. And we did sacrifice a little bit on the rate of return. So instead of maybe a 0.7-year payback across those whole investments, we actually moved it to more 1.1, 1.3 years, but we more than tripled the volume of cash savings that was there. We were penalizing ourselves because of kind of preconceived notions and ideals of how you do financial calculations, and we were missing out on massive opportunity.
What do you think led you to change?
It
sounds like a very interesting process to go from kind of applying standard tools on a piecemeal basis and arriving at an answer of 30 projects that are fundable, and then suddenly kind of the light bulb going off, the compact fluorescent light bulb going off, and saving.
Very well said. Well said. Yes.
Well, can you talk a little bit about the organizational processes that were behind that?
There was a lot of mocking and that sort of thing that was involved in the process, because it was essentially this. By going through that process, we learned there is a massive amount of opportunity that's sitting on the table that even after we've implemented efficiency technologies is just sitting there, and nobody realizes it. You don't realize it not because the technology isn't there or not because people don't have a willingness. It's because of the classical ways that we define our boundaries and view things. You know, in business, we always talk about the silos. If I was to equate my role is part psychologist, part silo breaker. Right. It's to break through these issues and these kind of artificial constraints that prevent us from doing these things. You know, and when we actually originally started our project and our commitments with the WWF, we originally said we'll deliver 8% absolute carbon reduction. We projected it would cost us $19 million in capital to do it, and it would have to deliver $32 million in cumulative EBITDA contributions to the corporation by 2013. That was using the very traditional approach. Using this more advanced approach, looking at it holistically, we actually found that we underestimated our targets. And we came back and said, you know what, it's not 8%, it's 25%, absolute. And in fact, the nice thing was I didn't need $19 million to do this. I only needed 14, and I could still deliver that same $32 million, if not more. But it takes a different approach.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Paul, you want to jump in?
Yeah, let me tell a couple of short stories. And I think one thing that might be useful to take it back to your own projects. I understand everyone did projects this summer. I'm sure your projects are well defined. Truth be told, though, at least in my view, you know, if inertia was the thing, many of those things won't get done and won't get funded. And I think that the thing might be is to, I don't know if they're actually going to track them or not, or to think through how can you improve the chances of your project, work hard, getting done, or if it doesn't get done, what lessons can you take from that to your next job? And I've got three real client stories, real short ones. One was a company we're working with, a retailer, very aggressive on cost. Their whole culture was about saving costs. They're 30% cheaper than Walmart in the grocery business. Some of the stores are growing like a weed. They beat the living crap out of the pencil vendors. Energy, not even on their radar screen. And they have these huge DCs, these warehouses. Half it's dry, the other half's refrigerated, the other half's warehouse, 50% energy surcharge during the day. And we were able, through some analysis, finding out if they just set zero capital, set the temperature 3 degrees warmer in the day during peak and 3 degrees cooler at night, so it would kind of cool up the box, $80,000 yearly savings for each of their 12 warehouses. And you know, one big question we struggle with is, you know, here's a company whose culture is cost savings against Walmart, yet they have this blind spot or skills or whatnot. So I think that the first thing is, you know, sometimes it's not capital, sometimes it's accountability to get project success. Another one, this one's a lighting example. Similar thing, we had 2 or 3 lighting examples. They depended on a lot of these incentives. One was a $400,000 lighting project, $200,000 incentive. Project didn't go forward. At the end of the day, when you really figure it out, it was internal politics. The local facilities guys and everyone said, we're not about to do a project that's going to get $200,000 of credit back to the corporate guys. So there it was the kind of a mismatch between, you know, really having a corporate savings, where the savings went back to the corporate side, because the tax rebate went back to the corporate side versus the local level. So that was one on the ownership side there. And the third one was example of where, again, a lot of exciting things happen in frozen warehouses. So these huge frozen warehouses that have all the hamburgers, that go all these fast foods. It's because you open it up and it's cold, you got to leave the lights on all the time because it's a lot of new technology coming down the pike, LED, where you can take a $300,000 a year electricity spend for that cooling, drop it at like 10,000. I mean, it's unbelievable because you turn it on, LEDs come on right away, and as soon as you turn it off, you can turn them off right away. And we said, this is a no-brainer. How could any company possibly say no to that? And we're one company, and it got to the CFO and everyone else, and the project didn't go forward here, and did a postmortem. And the biggest postmortem we came back in is basically the senior management CFO saying, listen here, we've been dealing with capital projects and facilities for 10, 15 years here. Any estimate of benefits that come up, we typically double or triple them, because we don't have enough confidence in the benefits. The facilities team had burnt themselves in the past. They didn't put measurement and verification and proving of it. And there was kind of a credibility issue that we have since gone back and tried to address. But it's 3 kind of quick stories there of things that are happening in the trenches. And I think particularly the balance you have of having an MBA and learning this stuff to help the business articulation of these technical things is helpful to get these projects over the line. So 3 horse. A lot of projects did go through, but I've only teed up 3 that hit some of the challenges.
No, that's great. That's great. When you think about companies operating in the current environment, and everybody wants to conserve cash, especially that was especially true after the financial crisis immediately hit in 2008. And it seems like on the one hand that kind of cuts both ways for what you guys are describing. On the one hand, you've all given stories where you can save substantial amounts of cash by taking relatively modest measures. But on the other hand, these measures require cash outlay up front. How has sort of the crisis mentality affected the way people go about implementing energy-saving projects? I mean, I can take a guess as to which of these 2 forces looms larger in most people's minds, at least initially. So I can imagine there's a lot of discussion about how to make the other force loom larger. Can you talk a little bit about that process and how you kind of put the focus on the cash savings instead of the cash outlay? Anybody can kind of jump in at will here.
I'll start with healthcare, how I look at it from that perspective. I think every industry has to look at it a little bit differently. A hospital, you break down their operating costs, 40 to 50% of that relates to salaries and wages and benefits. 20% of that relates to supply costs, plus or minus. You've got 14 or 15 to 20% of uncompensated care you have to account for. And you have this big bucket called other, which is 20 to 30%. So in that other bucket is where your energy costs for a hospital would lie. And that runs about 1 to 2%. So 1 to 2% of the operating costs of a hospital is energy related. And as a financial officer of a hospital is concerned, you can see they've got a lot of responsibility, a lot of issues of replacing medical equipment to maintain a competitive practice in that particular market. And you have all these competing forces going on. So how do you get a project set up, energy efficiency project set up to compete in that kind of environment? How do you get that done? Well, that's where the creativity comes in, and I think that a lot of discussion of asking questions is kind of the first thing to figure out how to get these projects funded. So the question you have to understand is, how do you see things from the CFO's perspective? We've had some good success with that. Is what are the pressure points that they're dealing with every day? They have a standard answer, and the answer is no. So how do you get the no to yes and understand from their perspective? So that comes about by really asking a lot of questions. Again, going back to Nick, when he first started with us, and all of you that have been with the Climate Corps out there working with the companies, it's a great thing to ask a lot of questions through Climate Corps or through your first job to learn about what the business does so that you successfully figure out, okay, how do I maneuver my way through to come up with the solutions that would get considered? To come in there and say, hey, I got all these great ideas, slap on somebody's table and say, will you fund these? Isn't the way that usually works. It works through a process of building camaraderie, relationship, collaboration to get to the point where they say, okay, now what's the economics of this? So now you're competing on sort of the same terminology and the same basis. I'm biased on investing in energy projects because they're a very good, stable investment. I mean, if you look at where to put your money today and what kind of return investment you're going to get to energy, I mean, it's a pretty solid bet. You can calculate what it's going to be. You can show the results pretty reliably. And so with that, it's a very compelling case. Now, how do you still get to the financing question? If I have a limited amount of capital, another way of looking at it is to let energy savings help pay for the capital costs. And there's a lot of the ESCO models of how you do cost share with somebody bringing the third-party capital in to get those done. It all depends on what your long frame horizon is, time frame is, and how patient you are to get to those savings.
So healthcare is interesting in particular because that's a sector where the business model is subject to a lot of other risk. I'm thinking about the regulatory risk, healthcare reform, things like that. When you have something like healthcare reform, that could fundamentally alter your business model in ways that are very hard to predict. What does that do to the discussion about energy? I mean, does it just shut it down and say, guys, we can't talk about light bulbs anymore because, we've got all this stuff we don't even know how it's going to shake out? How does that play out? Because it seems, we at Duke do this thing called the CFO survey. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but we go out and we survey a lot of CFOs, and the questions change. But one of the early things we did when we were surveying CFOs was we were asking them sort of what are the criteria that are really important for you, and financial flexibility was a huge item in terms of a criterion behind their decision making when they were making financial decisions. I can see, with healthcare reform, I can see the need to make energy arguments as we need a lot of flexibility because we're facing a very volatile future. This is a way to buy some flexibility by lowering costs because we actually know that energy costs are going to rise. That's one thing we know for sure.
One of the challenges in healthcare is you're either operating in the red, the middle, or somewhat profitable. And last study I heard, I think hospitals had an operating margin of single digit, 3.5%, but there can be less, they can be more. I saw with one hospital system that they were running about 1.5% margins. So when you have that challenge, you're saying, I'm just trying to keep the doors open and provide the services. How do you get into their mind to say, well, let's look longer term to help stabilize some of those costs that are going to ramp up? Because the last thing you want to have is that 1% go to 0.5% and flip the other side of being in the red. So I think it's a very compelling argument.
Yeah. I do think, though, certainly last year I think was an anomaly of a year. We had one customer went from $6 billion to $2 billion in sales through 6 layoffs in 14 months. And I think there's enough. You're doing like that, you're in safety mode. It's hard to even plan out. So I think that's clearly a point where everything was put on hold.
Sure.
But I think even we're seeing companies where it's hard for them to understand what their plant configuration may be 2 or 3 years out, and then start investing any of that. It's really hard. Particularly some of these technologies, you need 5 to 6 years to get the payback. So I think there's I think it's flexibility, financial flexibility, but also think it's stability that's also needed on the core business, and at least direction where the business is going, to understand where these investments.
Yeah, I would also say that we came across a fairly unexpected side effect of managing our projects on a portfolio basis, and that is this inherent nimble nature of annual investments. A lot of times when we put together our budgets and our plans, it's going to include potentially 100, 150, maybe 200 different projects, different investments scattered all over the world. And that portfolio is set to consume a certain amount of capital to deliver a certain rate of return and a certain rate of carbon return. Now, what happens though, and this, I think the last 2 years were evident of that, is things can change very quickly. And by maintaining this very nimble type of program, it's actually very advantageous for us and very unique for us, as it turns out, to have the CFO or the CEO come in and say, you know what, we're going to have to cut back on some capital, but I want you to tell me what is that going to do on the rate of return or the volume of return that I'm going to have at a certain time horizon. We're uniquely positioned, as opposed to virtually any other portion of our business, to actually answer that question quite unequivocally. And you end up in a very strange position. I had probably the single strangest experience of my professional life last year in going through my budget. I'd been told all the way up through the treasurer of the company that capital's constrained, and don't you dare ask for more than $2 million this year. So I had my original $4 million budget, and I pared it down to $2 million of projects, still delivering our carbon commitments and making some adjustments on the financial returns. And every year I have to march into the CEO's office and argue my budget to him. So I sat down on the table, and I had a very lovely presentation. All put together, it was great. And I got about 5 seconds into it, and he cut me off. He said, "Jeremy, what are you doing?" And I said, "What your treasurer told me." And he said, no. He said, "Everybody comes in my office every year asking for capital." He said, "You're the only one who comes in my office asking for capital that can actually guarantee savings and has the ability to verify it after the fact." Yeah. He said, "I want you to forget what you're told and leave." And I want you to come back, and your instructions are this. Your instructions are to go and assume no capital constraints, but I want you to maximize your investments over the next 3 years to deliver me the single best EBITDA contribution at a specific date and time. That's what I want. You still have to deliver your carbon, so no sacrifices there, but retask your portfolio over the next 3 years. So went back and adjusted it, and came back and said, I need $5.6 million. And I got the first $5.6 million out of our global allocation of capital expenditures. Everybody else got to take their piece after that. But we were uniquely in a position to do that because we had already amassed all of this data. We had all of this information. And more important than anything is after we do these investments, even on the little scale, we can measure and see, did we perform? Did we deliver the energy savings that we had expected? Sometimes we did, sometimes we didn't. But we can also understand why they work. Sometimes, we had a really successful efficiency project in one spot, but an indirect result was debottlenecking the plant. So we ultimately increased energy consumption. But you know what? That's a really important piece of information to have, that this investment on the surface might have seemed bad, but in reality it was good, and it's tempered against all the other things that we do. But a lot of this stuff really just comes down to good, solid information, systems in place to do this, and the willingness of the business themselves to be open enough to hear an alternative approach. And I think a lot of that comes from seeing the potential volume of savings.
That's fantastic. I know we're getting to the point where we probably want to turn the discussion inward to the table. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Let me open the floor. Absolutely.
A question for you, Professor. We're talking about financial project analysis and the tools that are available. Net present value, internal rate of return. We've heard people talk about payback, simple payback. From your perspective, how do those measure up, and which is the most appropriate to be used in these projects that we're looking at?
Well, I think, from a purely theoretical perspective, there's no question that net present value is the right way to look at a problem. But that requires some pretty strong faith in the numbers that you're putting into the model, and that's where your talk about verification, I think, is really, really important. And actually, I think I think this is an environment where applying NPV to decision rules is actually relatively more straightforward than it is in other settings in the firm. Just as you were saying, this is a situation where you know what the baseline is, you know what you're doing now, and you can model out what's going to change as a result of investing a fixed amount of money. You can all agree to what an appropriate discount rate is to think about smoothing investment over time. And those are really the ingredients that you need to arrive at an NPV calculation. And the fact is, NPV doesn't really care whether the payback occurs in 2 years or in 20 years. NPV is happy to have a very large payback 20 years from now, and that's preferable to a more modest payback 2 years from now. But what it's going to do is it's very naturally going to get you to that volume return number quickly, which I think, at the end of the day is really what you care about, what shareholders are going to care about. So, when I think about these problems, that's where I go first.
And that's my thinking as well. Second question, how often will using a simple payback methodology lead to a false result or an incorrect decision in terms of project prioritization?
Well, it depends on what that depends a great deal on the set of projects that you're choosing from. What a payback rule is going to do is imagine a situation where you have a 3-year payback rule, that's your criterion. You're looking at a project that's got a modest return in 1 year and a project that's got a whopping return in 5. You're going to make a colossally bad decision in that environment, where an NPV calculation is going to flip that around.
One other thing I would add as well is at least make sure also the line items are correct. For instance, we've seen things where some capital requests come in and where they aren't even, and you're looking at two pieces of equipment and it's labor savings, and no one's even asking the question yet, what's the difference between the energy usage of these two pieces of equipment? or what is the energy assumption and energy costs for the next 3 or 4 years on natural gas or electricity or whatnot. So I think it's not only getting the correct or multiple methods, it's making sure that we've got the right line items even in the calculation.
But I mean, this is where getting clear market signals about energy costs is so important. Because there are enormous pressures on firms to take short-term decisions. You know, you think about executive, the tenure of executive contracts builds in short-term thinking. Shareholders are very short-term driven. So there's enormous pressure to turn your back on the project with the longer payback that has the higher payoff and go for the shorter project. But the clearer and the stronger the market signals are, the easier it is to sort of move in the direction of making good NPV decisions.
One technique to use as well is a project that's under a year payback, you can use expense dollars to finance that. So that's usually a real good place to get some of those things done where they fall into the capital category. If you can do a direct offset during the current fiscal year, then those are ones to work off some opportunities right there in that same year.
So add to that too is that there is a tendency to fixate on the financial performance of individual projects. And I'm sure a lot of people in this room have seen themselves, is that when we do that and we make those short-term decisions, what oftentimes happens is we hamstring ourselves in the future for real investment and real improvement. And to a certain extent, the NPV may actually reflect that, but unfortunately, that's still an analysis fixated on a single investment.
Project by project, that's
right. So, I love to make fun. One of my favorite things is to make fun of this analogy of the low-hanging fruit, because in my mind, it's a terrible analogy. It's not a low-hanging fruit. In my world, it's a pie full of potential, or it's a tree full of potential pies. There's all these opportunities that are there. There's fruit at the top, fruit in the middle, fruit in the bottom. And if you fixate just on picking the one, and then picking this one and this one with no real strategy, no overt sense of direction, you're going to end up with just a bunch of really prime stuff that looks great and ripe that you can't reach. Instead, you need to look at holistically and say, okay, what are my objectives to deliver year over year over year? And sometimes I'm going to pick a high one, and I'm going to pick that high one with a bushel of lower ones. And I'm going to mix these things together. And what you start to find is that you don't run out. As you pick that one high one and the bunch of low ones, more of the low ones continue to grow in.
The tree keeps growing.
The tree just keeps producing. And I know, I've spoken to a lot of companies that say, well, we're running out of opportunities because we've plucked all the low-hanging fruit. And I said, well, of course you have, because you've plucked all the low-hanging fruit. Put together a strategy. These things require long-term thinking, and that long-term thinking, though, can still deliver the short-term results that shareholders require.
Yeah, that's really nice. I see.
That's a very interesting idea. Relating to that is, when you're evaluating these projects, do you only look at the simple payback, or how do you pitch that to senior executives when you say that, okay, so I can, in a building, for example, I can change the windows, and that is an empty of whatever, but I can change the windows, and then I can change the chiller, but I can actually, put in a smaller chiller, because if the windows are changed, so I don't have to cool the building as much. How do you pitch that, when you're trying to explain that, okay, so this project might have a 5-year payback, but combined with the other one that has a 1.5-year payback, I can, tunnel through this cost barrier.
Because efficiency should be measured on the macro level, not the micro level. And we all want to do that. I'm an engineer. I have a tendency to fixate on specific details and tweak every drop of COP I possibly can out of the chillers and every bit of efficiency on the boilers for the domestic hot water, and I completely forget the bigger picture here. We're actually, we have a really exciting project going on at our global headquarters building in Wisconsin. We're in the process of installing the first ever combined heat and power fuel cell in the Midwest, an area that nobody can ever touch because because electricity is so filthy cheap and it's so filthy dirty. It's the best place for investments, but it's the least financially beneficial. So we started in a long-term strategy, 4 years. This started out as a building that was LEED Gold certified, and when we're done, we'll probably shave about 40% of the energy consumption out of it after it was LEED Gold certified, in investments that deliver a little bit over a 2-year financial payback. And it's done through a multi-step deliberate process. When we talk about efficiency, we don't talk about it just as efficiency. We talk about 3 steps: avoidance, efficiency, generation. With our global headquarters building, the first thing that we did is we looked at this and said it's a giant office building for which the lights are on all night. Well, why are the lights on all night? Because we have the cleaning staff in there. Cleaning staff likes to have light to actually be able to clean. And we asked the question, why do they have to clean at night? 20 years ago, they cleaned at night because vacuum cleaners were loud. Now, vacuum cleaners and floor sweeps and that sort of thing is actually fairly quiet. And personally, I kind of like actually knowing who cleans out the trash and stops in my cube from time to time. So we made that change. It didn't take a penny, and it saved money on day one. And then we take that and say, okay, now we've generated some savings. Now let's go and say, let's make the lighting systems that we have now more efficient. Let's get rid of the junk and invest in making what we need to have better. And then let's look at taking that efficient system that has gotten rid of that inherent waste and reinvest that again and actually on-site power generation. So in total, it's a series of about a little bit over $3 million of investments that deliver some phenomenal energy, phenomenal cash savings, and frankly, the single best capital investment we will do anywhere in the world in terms of metric tons of carbon saving per capital dollar. But you don't get it by plucking fruit off of a tree. You get it by looking at the tree.
I really like that answer because I teach entrepreneurial finance, and what you've just described is called a bootstrapping strategy. I mean, you bootstrapped into the larger project through the savings you generated on the initial projects. That's really nice. Yeah.
I'm curious about, from your experience and working with other companies, how many of the companies that are committed to this have actually allocated, all right, we're going to put 5% or 1% towards energy efficiency projects, even though they're not revenue generating. Maybe not from your experience, because you're just so good, you're always going to get that $5 million. But how many companies out there in your experience are starting to do that?
At least in our experience, very, very few. I mean, I think the ones we see are most exciting is when there's a corporate commitment for sustainability. It's a large decentralized company, and there's at least some corporate funds, an energy manager up front that can really help it. Most companies don't do it. So, and typically then it's also the facilities or the production people coming through the same process. So it's I think we're still in the early days. I mean, look, earlier panel, AT&T just last year had a director of energy. I'd say 80% of the companies we're in do not have a person at the corporate level whose first, second, third, or fourth responsibility is energy. And I think because of that and a lot of things we talked today, the opportunity set's quite large here still. But there's a lot of things that need to be in place still.
Well, hospitals are high-intensity energy users for commercial building properties. And HCA, we have a Sustainability Steering Committee and group, and I head up an Energy and Water Task Force. So in that process, what the company has said is we're going to consider or put on a list, if you will, projects that have an ROI of 12 years or less. And that's kind of our, who funds a 12-year project? Well, it depends, but at least we're creating sort of this area of where we consider those projects. And then, but each project right now, it does compete with other projects, but it is considered a good return on investment.
So this is a question for all of you. A lot of the discussion has revolved around internal financing or capital financing, but what's your corporate perspective on third-party financing? So you mentioned performance contracting. Do you look at vendor financing? Do you look at operating leases? Because that reduces the capital required up front, but then introduces this other risk of working with another party. Just curious about what your perspective is.
I'll talk a little bit to that. Any kind of capital lease or anything you do has to be obviously disclosed. Sarbanes-Oxley, you have to. It's part of your credit risk, if you will, because you are having a commitment for some outward payments that you have to have commitments to. So a company has to stand back and say, what can I get financing for? What are my limits? And how can I issue a letter of guarantee that I can support those? The concept is very good, though. If a company is short on capital, it is another way to get it done. So it goes back to the creativity of figuring out ways to get things done. So let me give you a specific example. Lighting, for example, lighting retrofits, and Nick had done some work on this looking around payback on lighting, and so what capital is needed for that lighting. One option is to finance it yourself, another is to get a third party. And then in that process, you do a cost share. So you get some savings during that longer term commitment on the financing, but it does get the project accomplished.
Yeah, I think we found, I think in theory, none of us pay for all the capital of our cell phone up front. We eventually sign a contract for minutes. You would think that, and I think there's a possibility for that in corporate America. We certainly found on the production facilities, To get the third-party financing, they want to be in there verifying his assets, and the production guys don't want anybody in there. So that's a whole thing. You know, you get your office buildings, and either you own a few of them, or you're leasing a whole bunch of others, so you have the mismatch there. You get the accounting issues here with the very conservative ones there. So we have certainly found it challenging. Solar. You know, solar is great, but wait a minute, are we really going to be in that building for 15 years to get the payback? And I'm leasing my roof, and I've never done that before. And do I want to be the first CFO that approves a lease of a roof, and I'm retiring in 2 years? So, you know, I think those are some of the practical.
You better retire in 2 years.
Better retire, yeah. Want a solar project. So, yeah, I think it's very promising. I think it's still very early in our experience.
Yeah, I'd say there's two issues there, one simple, one a little bit more complicated. And the simple one is that these financing mechanisms work because the other party who puts up the capital obviously keeps the cash. Now, if you're under capital constraints and you really want to do this project, I guess you may find yourself in that position. But you know, it's important to note to the finance people that if we don't spend our own capital, we don't get to keep the money. You know, and remind them of that. The second issue is one that becomes a very complicated issue that you know, really begs for some type of international consensus of some semblance, and that's on the emissions attributes associated with those investments. I'd say at least once or twice a year, I'll have somebody come in and say, hey, we're going to fund this giant solar array or this giant wind turbine system. We'll put up the capital. You get to get a different price on electricity off of that, and you get to claim all these credits. Well, I hate to explain it, but you don't. You know, they're financing this off the sale of the RECs or the credits or the green tags, the white tags, whatever manifestation they take. You don't get to keep the environmental benefits of it. You've sold that. And it's a point that I don't think is understood very well. I just had a proposal that came from the Australian government 2 weeks ago for a major retrofit at one of our existing manufacturing plants. And in the financial savings calculations, they indicated we would be selling off these credits in the Australian market, which is really starting to blossom right now. And I immediately called them back up and said, well, why would we do that? If we do that, we lose the environmental attributes that are very, very dear to us. I said, well, no, you don't understand. You don't lose those. You still can claim you have these efficient lights and all this stuff. I said, no, we can't. In fact, if I were to really account for everything, if I sell you those credits, or I allow you to take those credits and sell those on the market, technically my emission rate for that specific drop of electricity is equivalent not to what my base emission factor is, but it's actually the emission factor of whoever the ultimate consumer is. Now tell me how I account for that. You know, there's a lot of this stuff going on, and it's completely unregulated. It's the Wild West. And it's something to be very, very wary of, because I would say the 3 major projects that we've seen on on-site power generation, all 3 of those had those embedded in. The first 2 refused to remove them. The third one finally did. But you're talking multi-year arguments, and they're deep, deep within contract language. So I caution anybody in that.
Let me take a final question, and then I want to turn the discussion inward around the tables.
Thank you. So I had a terrific summer at Adidas as a Climate Corps fellow, and I'm now taking corporate finance by one of your colleagues at Yale. And we're learning that discount rates should be project specific, and they should reflect the degree to which a project covariates with a market portfolio. So given the classical definition of a discount rate, what is an appropriate discount rate for an energy efficiency investment?
I'm going to write these answers down.
Same as every other investment. There's you know, I think a trend that has naturally arrived from this limited view of financial approaches and different tools usage that requires you to use different discount factors, different returns for these sustainable related projects. And I'd argue that is unsustainable in and of itself. You know, it can last as long as your current board of directors and CEO is interested in it. One of the key components of our programs is that we will not set a different financial performance criteria. We won't, because if we do, it's not going to last in the long term. The next recession, the next turn back, the fears of a double dip, whatever it may be, will completely rule those projects out in the future. We need to be able to perform on the same level that everybody else does when it comes to capital investments. You know, it's one of the things where it's an amazing thing. As a company, we could go and take all of the capital dollars that we've set aside and promised these programs, and we could buy RECs, we could buy credits, and we can offset all of our emissions for a few years. And you know what? At the end of the day, it's going to be irrelevant because it won't make a difference. But if we can show that following a uniform approach, using the same kind of discount factors as any other projects, and do it in a financially attractive manner on a repeatable basis in a lot of different approaches, that's something that can then be emulated elsewhere, and we can actually get sustained improvements over a much larger breadth of companies, not just one little $3.5 billion company.
Here's the challenge real quick, and that is, some of these things you can say, we'll put on a nice spreadsheet and analyze what the costs are and the savings are going to be. But let's take the idea of converting a typical building to a smart building. I don't know if you know, most buildings in the United States are dumb buildings. They've got building automation systems, but they're not very well connected to work effectively, run the building. So let's say you want to move your building to a smart building and have to invest in the infrastructure to do that. If you try to analyze, okay, that's the cost to make that building smart, to what I think will make it more energy efficient, but I'm not quite sure how all these complicated things come together, but I know intuition that it will make a difference. How do you sell that if it's just on some kind of a financial performance number? So it gets back to that high fruit up there. You know that has an impact over the whole tree, but it's something you have to invest in if you're going to make further progress in energy reduction. So it's sort of a little bit of a sunk cost for a bigger objective you're accomplishing down the road.
I think in keeping with our the format of the earlier panel, I think now what we should do is kind of turn the discussion inward around the table and kind of carry on this same discussion, but amongst yourselves. And then what I'd like to do is around maybe 2:20 or so, I'd like to kind of pull back and kind of all join together again. Hello, everyone. By my watch, it's around 2:25, and so I thought maybe we could take just the last 4 or 5 minutes and maybe share some of the ideas that are coming out of the table discussions. I know we're due for a coffee break very soon, but let's take a minute and just kind of offer the discussion out to the broader group. Would anybody like to kind of volunteer to share what their table was discussing, kind of share some of the ideas? Thanks. Great. Now I can cold call on people.
All right, so our group, we first talked about this whole discount rate issue, and we kind of struggled with whether or not we should have risk-adjusted discount rates. If you have a project that has, Energy Star ratings and know the rates, and it's a 20% more efficiency, whether that should be the same discount rate as a new product that has no. But we didn't settle on anything. So. But one of the cool things that we thought we would bring up, since we're at Duke, we were talking about impediments, and our REI colleague here mentioned that the structure was like the NCAA bracket challenge, where we had a lot of silos. And I don't know if can you explain that maybe a little bit more? Because I know we wrote it down, but here you go.
Just real simply with REI, with our energy efficiency investments in the past, we've had our different divisions, so our retail division, our support facilities, our distribution centers, kind of competing internally for capital money. And so in retail, it's competing against the next new store that we build. And the NCAA bracket challenge is just a metaphor for saying that the second best project in one bracket could actually be the best project somewhere else. And so we're working on transitioning to have which makes perfect sense, but a portfolio view of all the investments we could make to make sure that each dollar is going towards where it makes the most impact and has the best return for us.
And then finally, we settled the debate once and for all, use NPV.
Good answer. Would anybody? Great.
We also started out by talking about discount rates because we had a wide variety. Most people went with their company's discount rate. I was at a small company that didn't have a WACC and didn't believe in NPV. They only believed in payback. So I had an interesting challenge, and I used the EPA's discount rate, which I talked to the controller about, and he felt that that was fair based on how the market was performing. But it seemed like the consensus at our table was use the company's discount rate if they have it. And then the other thing we were talking about is how to compete with other investments. And so Jim, he was using, he opened his presentations. Do you mind if I talk for you? Go for it. Jim opened his presentations with this Ernst & Young quote about how rising energy costs are the biggest threat to business. And then Top five. Oh, boy, that was nice. And then I kind of framed it as well in terms of urgency by saying my business was small, like I said. Their electricity bill was $400,000 a year, so that's how I opened my presentations, because it was a huge chunk of their expenses. So that kind of enabled them to think, well, this is really a pressing issue. Not that they didn't already. All of our companies felt that way, but it's one thing to bring someone on and another thing to make sure that your project doesn't get put in a drawer. So.
I see culture over here, and I'm wondering if any of you guys would be willing to talk a little bit about what your discussion was. That was actually from the last. Oh, okay. That makes a lot more sense then. Okay. I'm, as a finance guy, that was a strange word for me.
Just something real quick. So we were discussing the NPV and the payback period as well. And what we came to is that sometimes NPV doesn't work because a large percentage of the building stock in the United States is leased, it's not owned. And if your lease expires in 5 years, you don't care if the NPV over 20 years is positive. It has to at least pay back in those 5 years. So that develops this whole principal agent problem of who owns the space and how can we invest in energy efficiency that is longer lasting.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Well, I think we're getting dangerously close to our coffee break time. So I think that what I'd like to do is just conclude by thanking Jeremy and Brian and Paul for leading us off on a great discussion. Thanks very much.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.